What if the biggest breakthroughs in your life don't come from being the smartest in the room, but from caring obsessively about things other people overlook? Sounds familiar, right? Because deep down, you're the type who notices details, the type who feels design, the type who knows that how something feels matters just as much as what it does. That instinct, that feeling, is the same force that shaped Apple and Pixar. And the crazy part? Both revolutions came from one college dropout with no engineering degree, no business training, no formal plan. Just taste, curiosity, and almost unreasonable belief. But here's where it gets wild. Because everyone knows the myth of Steve Jobs, the turtleneck, the keynotes, the one more thing. That's the meme version. But the real story, the one rarely told, is about vision. Not as a talent you're born with, but as a muscle you can build. And once you understand how that vision worked, you realize something uncomfortable. You've probably had a glimpse of that same spark before. You just talked yourself out of it. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Let's start where most great journeys start, with rebellion. Steve Jobs never fit the mold. Not in school, not in college, not even in the early computer world. He was too curious, too restless, and too allergic to doing things the normal way. And believe it or not, that was exactly the point. He grew up around machine parts in a simple California garage, learning from his adoptive father that even the parts no one sees should be beautiful. That invisible craftsmanship later became Apple's religion. Even the insides of early Macs looked elegant. Engineers thought it was ridiculous. Jobs thought it was respect. The difference between the two? Vision. But here's where it gets real. Jobs wasn't some well-behaved prodigy studying quantum physics at 14. He was skipping classes, taking LSD, meditating in orchards, and chasing Eastern philosophy. He dropped out of Reed College, slept on floors, audited calligraphy classes, and worked briefly at Atari making video games. Basically, the kind of path that would make most parents say, "What are you doing with your life?" But here's the twist. Those useless detours became the foundation of Apple's design language. The calligraphy classes became fonts. The Zen mindset became simplicity. The LSD and counterculture scenes became the obsession with breaking norms. It's motivational in a brutal way. The things that look like distractions might actually be the seeds of your future masterpiece. Ever felt guilty for not following the safe timeline? Yeah, same energy. Fast forward to 1976. Jobs teams up with Steve Wozniak, the shy engineer who could practically make circuit boards out of thin air. Woz had the brains. Jobs had the taste. Together they made something the world had never seen, a computer normal people could actually use. Pause for a second and let that sink in. Because today we take user-friendly for granted. Tap, swipe, scroll, pinch to zoom. But in the 70s? Computers were cold, blinking beasts for hobbyists and labs. The idea that technology should feel human was almost laughable. But Jobs insisted. And here's the secret that shaped everything after. He didn't start with what was technically possible. He started with what was emotionally desirable. Then he forced reality to catch up. People called it stubborn, arrogant, unrealistic. Jobs called it vision. And whether you're building a company, a career, or just trying to design your future, that mindset is a cheat code. But don't get too comfortable, because every hero's journey needs a fall. Apple blew up fast. The Apple II sold millions. The company went public. Jobs became a millionaire before 30. And just when the world thought the movie was over, Jobs pushed for something even crazier, the Macintosh. Graphical interface, icons, windows, a mouse, color, personality. It was friendly. It was fun. It was rebellious. It was Apple saying, computers shouldn't just work, they should delight. You can feel Pixar echoes already. simple, emotional, human. But success has a price, and ego has a timer. And here's where the story flips. Because Jobs demanded perfection, and perfection demands friction. Teams burned out, costs exploded, critics attacked, and the board eventually did something unthinkable. They kicked the visionary out of his own company. Imagine being fired from the thing you built, the identity you shaped, the baby you raised. Most people never recover from that kind of humiliation. But wait till you hear what Jobs did next. When Apple pushed Jobs out in 1985, most people assumed the story was over. The prodigy had flown too close to the sun, melted his wings, and crash-landed in corporate politics. Roll credits, tragic genius, blah, blah, blah. But here's where things get interesting. Because that exile wasn't an ending. It was a forge. And if you've ever been rejected, underestimated, or told you're too much, you already know what comes next. Either you shrink, or you sharpen. Jobs sharpened. He built a new company called Next. It wasn't designed for mass adoption. It wasn't meant to please shareholders. It was pure vision. Elegant hardware, insane attention to detail, software so advanced that Tim Berners-Lee would later use a Next computer to build the first website. Let that sink in. The internet was born on the machine made by the guy everyone had written off. Life has a dark sense of humor. But here's the twist. Next didn't make money. It wasn't a commercial hit, and yet it became one of the most important failures in tech history. Because vision works like that. It doesn't always give you trophies. Sometimes it gives you tools. And those tools come back later. Meanwhile, something else was brewing. Something that would change storytelling forever. In 1986, Jobs bought a small group from George Lucas for $5 million. At the time, it wasn't a sexy acquisition. It wasn't even obvious what the company actually was. It made hardware for animation studios. It wasn't profitable. It wasn't mainstream. Most investors would have said, why bother? Jobs saw something different. Artists who loved technology. That company became Pixar. And if Apple was about making technology feel human, Pixar was about making stories feel real. But here's the underrated part. Jobs didn't create Pixar's magic. John Lasseter, Ed Catmull, and the creative team did. Jobs provided belief, capital, operational structure, and, most importantly, protection. He let artists be artists. He let technology support emotion. He trusted taste. Toy Story released in 1995, the first full-length computer-animated film in history. Hollywood thought it was a gimmick. Then it broke the box office and flipped the industry upside down. After that came Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Wall-E, Up. Pixar didn't just win awards, it created culture. And again, notice the pattern. Simple, clean, emotionally powerful storytelling. Apple did that with products. Pixar did that with movies. You start to realize Jobs didn't just build companies. He built experiences. And experiences create loyalty. But before we go further, ask yourself something. What are you building right now that looks like a failure only because it's early? Because Pixar was a money pit for years. Next was called pointless. Jobs looked like a washed-up perfectionist. But here's where the story snaps back around. By the mid-90s, Apple was dying, not slowly, rapidly.
Sales were down, products were confusing, innovation had stalled. The board was cycling through CEOs like spare batteries. The brand that once stood for rebellion now felt tired. Apple needed a savior. But it didn't need a manager. It needed vision. So in 1996, in a poetic twist, Apple acquired Next for $429 million. And with Next came the man they once exiled. The comeback had begun. Jobs didn't sweep in with inspirational speeches or kumbaya meetings. He did something far more brutal and far more necessary. He simplified. He cut product lines. He killed side projects. He trimmed teams. He slashed distractions. He forced a binary question into the DNA of the company. Does this matter? If not, it died. Most people think innovation is adding things. Jobs understood the secret. Innovation is removing things. Pixar did it in storyboards. Apple did it in hardware. Both did it in identity. But here's where it gets real again. Because vision alone is not enough. You need execution. Enter Tim Cook. Jobs may have been the artist, but Cook was the operator. The combination of those two, vision plus system, would become one of the most powerful duos in business history. And just when Apple stabilized, Jobs did the thing only a storyteller would do. He reframed the narrative. Think different. Not a slogan, a manifesto. A rallying cry, a reframing of what Apple meant. A reminder that creativity is rebellion with direction. Then came the products. iMac, iTunes, iPod, and soon after, a device that would collapse entire industries into a single rectangle. But the best part? We're just getting to the good part.
Imagine being in 2007. Cell phones are clunky, buttons everywhere, tiny screens, styluses, and menus buried 3 layers deep. The idea of a phone as a full computer sounded like sci-fi. But Jobs didn't see a phone. He saw a gateway. The iPhone wasn't technology for technology's sake. It was a belief that the device we touch most should feel intuitive, elegant, and personal. A tool that disappears into the background so the experience can shine. That's vision. Because anyone can build a product, few can build a feeling. And the feeling of Apple wasn't, look how smart we are. It was, look how empowered you are. That subtle shift is everything. And it's the same shift Pixar made. Pixar films weren't about showing off technical rendering. They were about heart, about childhood, about love, about memory, about purpose, about fear, about growing up and letting go. Tell the truth. You didn't leave Toy Story thinking, wow, excellent computational geometry on those shadows. You left thinking, damn, what if my toys had feelings? That's storytelling. That's empathy. That's culture. And here's the fun twist. Apple made tech feel human. Pixar made characters feel human. Jobs made both companies feel alive. But wait, here's where the story turns again. Because while the world saw a legendary comeback, Jobs had a silent villain growing inside him. Cancer. And what makes his final chapter so haunting is that it forced him to confront the one thing he couldn't control: time. In 2003, he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He delayed treatment, trying alternative diets, fruit fasts, herbal remedies. For a man who distorted reality for a living, cancer was the first opponent that didn't bend. He eventually had surgery, then a transplant, then multiple medical leaves from Apple. Tim Cook quietly took over operations. Jobs would return for keynotes, thinner, slower, but still electric. If you've ever watched that era of Apple keynotes, you know they didn't feel like product launches. They felt like performances, like unveilings, like acts in a play where tension builds and release hits right when the audience thinks they've guessed the ending. The famous "one more thing" wasn't just a phrase. It was theater. It was timing. It was Pixar-level narrative infused into Silicon Valley. But here's the deeper insight, the kind that matters for you. Vision isn't just about seeing what's possible. It's about making other people believe it too. That's the real skill. And Jobs knew how to transfer belief to investors, to employees, to customers, to entire industries. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. But now we hit the real gut punch, because hero stories usually end in triumph. Jobs's ends in legacy. In 2011, at just 56, he died. Too young, too soon, too unfinished. But here's the part that gives the story meaning instead of tragedy. Jobs didn't just leave behind products. He left behind playbooks. Apple's playbook for product excellence, Pixar's playbook for emotional storytelling, both rooted in the same three pillars. 1. Simplicity. Remove the noise so the truth can breathe. 2. Taste. Care about the details others ignore. 3. Integration. Control the entire experience so nothing breaks the illusion. Put those three together and you get movements, not companies. But here's where it loops back to you. Because you are not just listening to a biography right now. You're listening to a blueprint. Tell the truth. You have ideas, visions, sketches, plans, little obsessions that won't go away. But maybe you haven't executed them yet because you think you need permission, or resources, or timing, or credentials. Jobs had none of those. He started in a garage. He dropped out. He was broke. He was weird. He was difficult. He was unpolished. But he cared. Deeply. Obsessively. Sometimes uncomfortably. And that is what changed everything. But before we hit the final chapter, there's one more twist you need to hear. The one most people skip. Because Jobs didn't just change Apple and Pixar, he changed 6 industries, and none of them were accidents.
So let's shift the camera for a second, from Jobs to you. Because Jobs didn't have resources when he started. He didn't have a path. He didn't have credentials. He had curiosity, taste, and unreasonable expectations. And that's the quiet truth nobody teaches. The future isn't built by the most realistic people. It's built by the ones who refuse to lower their standards. Think about your life for a moment. Where have you been pretending to be reasonable just to avoid looking naive? How many ideas have you abandoned because they didn't make sense yet? How many dreams have you put on layaway waiting for the right moment? Be honest. You've had a next moment before. A Pixar moment. An exile that felt like failure, only to realize later it was incubation. Jobs got kicked out of Apple. So he discovered Pixar. Pixar made him rich, so he could return to Apple. Next failed commercially, so the internet could run on its software. His weird calligraphy class became Apple's typography. His Zen explorations became Apple's simplicity. The pattern is almost rude. The things that don't make sense now often become the things that make you make sense later. But here's where it gets real. Most people never get that payoff because they quit mid-chapter. They panic during their exile. They abandon their Pixar moment. They bury their next era. And maybe you're there right now. Maybe you're building something nobody understands yet. Maybe you're stuck in a season that looks like failure. Maybe you're surrounded by people who just don't see it. Jobs had that too. Woz saw it. Lasseter saw it. But the world didn't. Not at first. Every visionary looks delusional, until the world adjusts. Now here's the Pixar twist, the pattern interrupt, the thing that snaps you awake. If you already know what your final form looks like, it's not a vision, it's just a plan. Vision is the part you can feel but can't fully articulate, the part that makes you restless, the part that wakes you up at night, the part that keeps haunting you at 3 a.m. when everyone else is asleep. So let's land this plane with one more observation. Jobs never saw Apple as a tech company. Pixar never saw itself as an animation company. Both saw themselves as storytelling companies. Apple told stories with products. Pixar told stories with characters. Both made people feel something, and that's why people cared. Because no matter how advanced the world gets, humans run on emotion, your career, your brand, your relationships, your art. They're all storytelling problems. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What story are you building right now? Not the one you tell others. The one your actions are telling for you. Because if this hit home, if something in you stirred, it means the universe just nudged you. Don't waste nudges. Don't settle for realistic. Don't wait for permission. Don't postpone the chapter you're supposed to be living. Jobs didn't. Pixar didn't. And you don't have to either. If this resonated, don't just scroll. Hit subscribe and keep building the story only you can tell.